Tonight on Nation to Nation, more Indigenous-led criminal justice services will soon be available with a boost from the federal government.
The people that we're serving is very significant because we're able to provide those services that some mainstream systems cannot address.
Identifying legitimate Indigenous businesses across Canada will be made a little easier with a new set of guidelines.
We developed the definition because we're trying to make sure that we have a certified Indigenous business directory that people can feel confident about using.
The Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples says Trudeau is to blame for his organization being ignored by Ottawa.
Probably been rooted a number of years ago when the Liberal government was elected, and to me, I believe they launched one of the biggest disinformation campaigns in Canadian history in terms of Indigenous people.
Ani, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. Indigenous-led justice services across Canada will soon be more accessible. The federal government announced an investment of just over $2 million earlier this week, aimed at addressing the gross overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. Chantel Barker is the Executive Director of Aboriginal Legal Services. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
$2.1 million in funding to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system. How significant is this?
Well, to the people that we're serving, it's very significant because we're able to provide those services that some mainstream systems cannot address. Like when we look at our alternative dispute resolution, like our community council and our Guin Denung program, we incorporate traditional practices like smudging before we go into a circle. We include an elder there for support, and also family and community support as well. So those are things that you don't really see in mainstream practices, so that for the people that we're serving, it is significant. And then as well as the GLADU reports, like we have the funding for GLADU reports and GLADU caseworkers. And I would say like majority of, if not all of our GLADU writers and caseworkers are all Indigenous. And so when you're Indigenous, you can you can understand and empathize with the people that you're working with, because you too, as a person writing the report, has been impacted by colonization, residential schools, intergenerational impacts, and etc. So because we have that understanding, we're able to articulate it in our reports that will be for the benefit of the Indigenous people that we're writing these reports for. And then if we're looking at our GLADU caseworkers, then we're being able to understanding that when you're addressing that trauma for the very first time, I know from myself as a previous probation officer, when we used to write GLADU reports, it's like the report is done, file is closed, and that was it. But at least with our GLADU caseworkers, we're able to provide that support and aftercare, and say that, okay, now that you've addressed some of these things that maybe you have never talked about before, how can we help you to heal now and restore some balance? What community supports do you need? Do you need access to elders, etc.? So those are things that that we're able to provide for Indigenous clients and done by Indigenous people.
So how many people could this help?
Well, it depends. Like our caseworkers, they have, especially when we look at our GLADU writers, they have a very full caseload where they could have 5 to 10 reports or letters a month. And so we have, I would say about 15 GLADU writers and caseworkers. So when you're looking at that, and then you're timesing that by 10 by 12, then you're looking at hundreds of people that we can help. And so, but I also look at it as well when we're looking at it, and if we're providing any kind of support and healing for that one individual, we're not only healing that individual, but we could be making an impact on that individual's next 7 generations. If we were able to help break some of those cycles by restoring that healing and that support, And then we're able to break that cycle, which we know in our culture, we're always looking forward and thinking about the next 7 generations. So I look at that as well as not only as a collective, but as an individual basis, that if we're able to help them, then we're also helping their children, their grandchildren, great-grandchildren.
According to statistics, Indigenous women account for 50% of federally incarcerated inmates. Why is this, and how could these programs help, or could they make an impact on those numbers?
Definitely, because like I worked in the justice system before my life here. And so what I've learned from the mainstream society is very focused on punitive measures and punishment. But with Aboriginal legal services and the services we provide, we really focus on healing and healing the root causes of that individual, of especially that woman that may have never had that support before. So we look at using holistic approaches, family and community support to really try to restore balance, but provide programming that's going to be able to identify where did this root cause come from and what resources are needed to address that trauma. And so that's the difference between the mainstream and what we do is they're focused on punitive and punishment, where we're focused on healing the woman that we work with.
The federal government and provinces are moving to tighten Canada's bail conditions. How will this affect the programming?
Well, of course, we're definitely going to try to advocate for more diversions. And the thing is that when I'm asked that question regarding bail, definitely there needs to be some measures in place for those dangerous offenders. But from my experience, especially as a probation officer for 10 years, when I look at my caseload at that time previously, I would say I had 100 people on my caseload towards the end of my career as a probation officer, and 95% of those cases were Indigenous people that were on my caseload. And out of those 95% of people, I would only say maybe less than 5% were actually dangerous. A lot of it had to do with addictions and when things that they did while they were under the influence. And so there's a saying that I've always lived by that I heard from Ernest Mann many years ago, and it always stuck in my head. He said, if a system is making people sick, do we cure the people and put them in the system, or do we cure the system?
Okay, Miigwech, thank you.
Okay, thank you, and have a good day.
A new clear set of criteria has been drafted to help procurement agencies like the government identify legitimate Indigenous businesses across the country. That's coming up after the break. Ani, welcome back. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, or NACCA, is an umbrella organization for a network of Indigenous financial institutions across Canada. This week, it released a document to help procurement agencies like the government identify legitimate Indigenous businesses. Dawn Madabi Leach is the general manager of the Wabtec Business Development Corporation, an Aboriginal-owned and operated organization that delivers business financing and economic development services to First Nations and businesses located in northeastern Ontario. She also helped to pen the National Indigenous Business Definitions document. Dawn Madabi Leach joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The NACCA has just released its National Indigenous Business Definitions. Why is this needed?
Well, there's been an issue for many years about, ever since opportunities came up for financing for Indigenous businesses and also for procurement opportunities. So oftentimes the criteria that was provided allowed for people to self-identify as Indigenous, and that created a whole series of issues. And the other issue that's come about besides identity is the use of shell companies by large businesses who are looking to take advantage of the many procurement opportunities available to genuine Indigenous businesses.
So who has been involved in the development of it?
Well, a group of national Indigenous organizations got together to develop the National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada, which we launched in June 2022. And following that, we were working that strategy was called for in an OECD report. The OECD report, entitled Linking Indigenous Communities to Regional Development, also indicated that there's a need for a definition for Indigenous businesses in Canada. So that's kind of that was what they did, is it reflected what Indigenous people were saying to them on how we could be linked to these opportunities. So that definition started while we were developing the National Indigenous Economic Strategy at the same time. So, the strategy was developed by more than 20 national Indigenous organizations. So all those organizations were also invited to help out with the strategy, the definition. And in developing that, there's been a lot of voices and a lot of people around the table. Some have come and gone, but it took about 3 years to develop the new definition.
Tell me what types of definitions are there in how to look for a legitimate Indigenous business. What are some of the things that you can automatically start to look for?
Yeah, well, one of the first things that we thought was really critical and where we started was identifying how do you verify who's Indigenous. That was the most important thing. And we feel strongly that identification comes from community, not from organizations. So there's a lot of false groups and organizations across the country, and by the way, across the world. This is a global issue, that are claiming that they're Indigenous, but only Indigenous communities, such as First Nations, can say who their citizens are, and only the Inuit beneficiary agreements can say who their citizens are. And for the Métis, there's so many Métis organizations that are false across the country, but we've gone with the definitions put out, or the registries of those affiliates of the Métis National Council and the Manitoba Métis Federation. So if there's a Métis organization, we also look at the Métis settlements of Alberta as also defining, because I don't believe they belong to the other two Métis organizations, or as they call nations. So I think that's how they refer to them. So we feel that those are the only groups. So you might have I've heard of the woodland groups in the Atlantic Canada. They're not considered Indigenous, but they issue membership cards, and those aren't accepted in our definition.
Currently, the ArriveCan scandal has sparked questions about the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. Some Indigenous business owners fear this will leave a bad name for others seeking contract. Is this a worry? Have you heard this as well?
Well, of course, there's a concern raised out there, and that's why we developed the definition, because we're trying to make sure that we have a certified Indigenous business directory that people can feel confident about using. If we use these definitions, then I know that corporate Canada and the public service is welcoming the new definitions, because there's been so many attempts to define, but we felt we needed to hold a pen in developing that definition. We know where our identity comes from. So I think that was so key. So if we develop a certified Indigenous business directory, that should provide assurances to anyone who's trying to seek this or procure the services of an Indigenous business supplier or of goods and services.
Okay. The idea is setting aside government contracts for Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs has been around for years. Has it worked like it was supposed to?
No, it hasn't. I don't have any problems saying that. And that's why we have offered to the federal government to do this work. They actually have supported us in this work over the last 3 years. They are, if we had this definition finalized 3 years ago, they'd have been happy to start using that. And I know they're welcoming this work as well. So I think that that's a good thing. And the same with Corporate Canada. I have so many requests right now for a copy of the definition. And right now we're trying to put together more. I know you have the document there, which talked about how the definition was arrived at, or the definitions, because we have definitions for sole proprietorships, for for-profit companies and joint ventures and partnerships. And but we need just the simple definitions for people to read rather than the background. I think it's important to have that now, but it'll be important that they have a document that they could use that shows how to identify, and then where to get the help from our own organizations that'll be using this definition. And businesses will be certified and recertified because ownership changes.
All right, sounds like some good changes coming. Miigwech, thank you for taking the time.
Miigwech for inviting me again. I really appreciate it.
Stay tuned. After the break, we'll hear from the Vice Chief of a national Indigenous organization who has been getting the cold shoulder from the Trudeau government. Ani, welcome back. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is a national Indigenous organization that was founded in 1971. Over the years, its mandate and leadership has changed. But one thing that hasn't changed is CAP has always strived to represent non-status Indigenous people, whether they be First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. But in recent years, the organization has been having trouble getting recognition from the Trudeau government. Kim Bowden is the National Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. He joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Well, thank you for having me.
So for the past number of years, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples has been shut out of meetings or events with the federal government and some national Indigenous organizations. Why is that?
Well, it probably goes back, it's probably been rooted a number of years ago when the Liberal government was elected. And to me, I believe they launched one of the biggest disinformation campaigns in Canadian history in terms of Indigenous people and how we define ourselves as a people. And that's what they're using. And it's called this distinction-based policy approach. And it's really, really hurting us as a national Indigenous organization in Canada.
The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples has been in the past a well-known organization, Indigenous organization. What is it going to take to get back to where it once was?
That's a very good question. I think that because of our history, that certainly plays in our favor. 53 years now, and we've been at a number of historical agreements, for example, and we were at the constitutional table as well. These things should, to me, I really believe play a major role in terms of us as an organization and where we're going to go in the future. And I mean, we've heard it from the opposition. I can say this for sure. You know, they will be ensuring that we are back. The Liberal government under Trudeau is saying that, you know, really we kind of like we don't exist, but Poilievre said that we do. And they want us back, and there's a big reason we should be back. We're the largest organization in Canada, and from a national perspective, we have our affiliates all across Canada. We're community driven, and we shouldn't have a government trying to define who we are, and it's really, really frustrating.
Okay, the Auditor General is releasing a report next week, 3 reports next week on government spending. One of them is an audit on equitable access to First Nation and Inuit policing. What are you hoping to hear from that?
I'm really hoping that they do the right thing. Right now, I know that, based on my research, that Canada spends about a little under 21 billion per year in terms of policing in Canada, and a very, very small percentage of that is directed towards police services that impact Indigenous people in Canada, on reserve as well, and that should be priority number one, and I'm really hoping it reflects that. The other thing I'm hoping, it doesn't say that we're underspending, because to me, I really believe we're overspending in terms of the overall picture, in Canada. So, yeah, I'm hoping that's the direction it goes.
How much of an impact do you think this would have, the audit would have, on policing, First Nations policing?
I believe that it will shine a direct light on what's really going on here in Canada, and that the federal government, under the Ministry either of Justice or different even premiers, need to react to this as well in Canada. And again, they're playing political football. I mean, I'll give you an example. With the hearing there that wrapped up in Saskatchewan, Miles Sanderson hearing, they talked about how they wanted their own police services, James Smith, and they should have their own police services. It's important that they do, because that relationship between the reserves and with respect to the RCMP, for example, wasn't very good. And I really believe that needs to happen. They should have their own police services. It's very important.
You sat in on that coroner's inquest into the mass shootings at James Smith Cree Nation. You had said at the time you were frustrated with those recommendations. Why is that?
Well, like I said before, is that it was very important that we follow through with them. And there was 29 of them. And what I believe is that there should be some teeth into them. In some cases, I believe that the Coroner's Act should be changed, so that these departments need to not react to them, to actually put things in motion. And because we can recommend. I sat in a number of hearings, whether it be human rights complaints, for example, or people dying in our prisons and that, and we recommend, but then I don't see a real huge shift in terms of either policies or the directions that they're going. So it's a really, really important that we follow through. And that's what I was getting and the other thing that really frustrated me as well is sitting there, and I felt that the community in general wasn't really being heard, the people that are really on the ground. And I talked to quite a few of them that were there, and they felt frustrated as well. And that's why I think it's important to hear. The community needs to be heard, and once we get that nailed down pat, I think we can go in a much more positive direction. I also believe too with that hearing that it had a lot of national implications as well. I mean, I know it was focused in terms of James Smith, but I mean, this could happen anywhere in our communities, and we need to take a good look at it and see what really happened, and I actually called for a national inquest. I believe that that's important. I'm sure there's a number of people who would agree with me as well.
Okay, Miigwech, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for tonight's Nation to Nation, and if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. Miigwech, and have a good night.